What's up, YouTube friends? So I haven't done a quilt in quite a while, so today I decided to do a beginner's quilt, a beginner strip quilt from start to finish. And this is going to take me all day probably, so let's get started. The things you're going to need are, of course, one jelly roll. Now these are 2.5-inch strips by the width on the bolt, so that's normally 40 to 42 inches. There are 40 strips in here, so make sure you get one that has 40 strips. There are some out there that have like 20 or 25. If that's all you can find, go ahead and get 2 of those. Now the great thing about these is that all the fabric coordinates. Now I know in the beginning when I started quilting, coordinating fabric was kind of a pain. So this makes it very simple, very easy, and you get beautiful results. Now I got this one off of Amazon and it's called Open Water. Now the reason why I chose this, it's a nice batik. And I just really like blues. Now I've already made a quilt just like this and I actually got quite a few comments on it. I showed it in a previous video. So my goal today is to make a matching quilt just with different colors. Now you're also going to need about a yard of fabric, and that's going to be our little accent squares as well as our sashing. So what I did was go ahead and I cut all of that into 2.5-inch strips. I have 8 of them right here for the sashing, so I'm planning on doing 2 strips per side. I know I will have some extra, but it's always good to have too much than too little. And then out of the rest of the strips, I went ahead and I cut 40 squares. You're only going to need 39, but like I said, more is better. You're also going to need some sort of backing. Now I'll be using this black fabric, and I don't know how well it's picking up on camera, but it's kind of mottled. It's not solid black. Now I always like to use something like this that's not a solid color for the border, and I usually use batiks, but since this is a batik, I went ahead and went with this choice. Batiks are a great choice because of the color variation per fabric, and it's very easy to match it to your quilt. Now this is actually 108 inches wide. It's actually backing fabric. It was on sale, so I grabbed a whole bunch of this. But I'll go ahead and I'll leave the measurements down below if you're just buying regular fabric off the bolt. Just like the sashing strips, you're going to want 2 strips per side. And I think I'm going to do about a 4-inch, maybe 6-inch border. We'll find out. Next, you're going to need some sort of batting. I always like to use flannel, especially because I'm going to tie this quilt together. Now I'll also leave the measurements of how much I'm using on this. You could use batting if you wanted to. You need to check your packaging on your batting and it will tell you how closely your stitches need to be or your ties. And I'll tell you right now, there's going to be a lot more ties than if you just use flannel. And you're also going to need some backing. This is a sheet that I got at the Goodwill. It's a queen size sheet, I think. It might be a full, but I think it's a queen. And sheets are always a great, inexpensive way to back your quilts. I always find flat sheets at the Goodwill. It always seems like the fitted sheets are the ones that get all gross and nasty and throw it away, but the top sheets are always fine. And to tie this all together, I'll be using my red crochet thread. And then I have this huge needle. It's not necessary, but I can't find my ribbon needle right now. I'll also be using my iron and ironing board and sewing machine with matching thread. Today I'll be using cream. And just a little prep before we get sewing, you want to go ahead and wind about 2 or if not 3 bobbins. We're going to use a lot of thread today, and this is a perfect time to use up all those partial bobbins. Now I think this is a perfect beginner's quilt. By the end of this quilt, you'll not only know how to sew a straight line, but you'll have a pretty good idea on how to eyeball a 1/4-inch seam allowance. I don't think I forgot anything, so let's get the show on the road. Now this is one of my favorite parts. It's always like Christmas, and it's opening up the jelly roll. So now I'm just going to unroll it. And I'm going to keep my jelly roll as is. You might be tempted to mix up your colors, but you do not want to do that. You'll get a better blend of colors throughout your quilt if you leave it as is on the jelly roll. So now I'm just going to take my jelly roll and my squares, and I'm going to head on over to the sewing machine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my first strip. I'm going to lay it with my right sides together with one of my squares. Now my solid really doesn't have a right or wrong side, but make sure if yours does that it's the right sides touching. And then with a 1/4-inch seam allowance, I'm going to sew right along my edge. You could backstitch if you wanted to, but it's really not necessary at this point. After I get this one sewed on, I'm going to open it up. I'm going to grab my next strip from my jelly roll, and then I'm going to sew it right to this raw edge. And I'm going to continue to do that until I have one long piece of fabric. This is going to take a while, people. Alright guys, so I'm going to chain piece these together. I'll be using straight stitch like I said. My length is a 2.5 and that's perfect for quilting. And of course my width is a 0. So with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'm just going to sew right down my side. And you don't need a back stitch, but you can if you want. So it should look like that. Next, I'm going to grab my second strip from my roll. I'm going to lay it so my right side is facing up. And then I'm just going to take my red square and I'm going to lay it on there facing down. And then just sew that seam. Now I'm going to chain piece these together, so at this point, after you put your second seam on your little red square, I'm going to just come back and find the other end of my second strip. Make sure that it's facing up. It can be very hard to tell which way is right or wrong with these batiks, so just make sure. I'm going to grab my next square. And sew. Now you could just leave your red square at the bottom. So now I'm just going to open up my red square, grab my next piece, make sure that the right sides are touching, and sew. I'm just going to keep chain piecing these together until all 40 strips are sewed to one long strip. Now it should look something like this. So now I'm just going to go ahead and clip these apart. And then I'm just going to iron every little red square and I'm going to press my seams out. Now if you do happen to sew one of your squares to the wrong side, it's not a big deal. Go ahead and just take your seam ripper, pick your seam, and then sew it to the right side. Now once you have this all pressed and laying nice and flat, we're going to go to one of our end strips, it doesn't matter which one, and I'm going to cut off 18 inches. Just like that, and this will just go in my scrap bin. So now we just need to start sewing our quilt top together. So I have my beginning piece right here with the right side facing up. I'm going to go through my whole strip, making sure that there aren't any twists until I get to my end piece, and then I'm going to lay that so that the right side is facing down. Just like that. Now you could throw some pins in here if you wanted to, but it's really not that necessary. Like I said, this is a great beginner's project and a great way to learn not only the movement of the fabric, but also to trust your machine. So all I'm going to do is with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I just like to sew down a little bit, stop, reposition my fabric, sew a little bit, stop, and reposition my fabric if needed. And I'm going to do that the whole entire length of this strip. See you at the sewing machine. Alright, so I'll still be using my 1/4 inch seam allowance. My length is still a 2.5. I went the whole length of my strip to make sure there was no twists or turns, and the easiest way to do that is just to fold it in half, starting from your half crease, work your way all the way to the front, and you should be good to go. Now this time I will backstitch at the beginning and the end, and make sure you have a few extra bobbins all wound up, because you're going to need it. Nothing's more annoying than when you're in your sewing groove and you look back and realize you've been sewing without any bobbin thread for a while. It really puts a bee in my bonnet. So I'm just going to backstitch and sew the whole length of this strip. And it's going to seem pretty never-ending. If I had to pick a worst part for this quilt, this first strip would be it. So I'm not going to use pins on this. So what I'm going to do is just sew a little bit, realign my strip, and then just keep sewing. And just to make it a lot easier, I'm just lining up my fabric with the edge of my presser foot. It's actually a little bit over 1/4 inch, but it's fine. So I'm coming up to one of my red squares. You just want to make sure that your seams are laying flat, and mine are. And just so. All right, so I have that whole strip sewed, finally. So now I'm just going to take my scissors. Right here is my crease or my fold. With my scissors, I'm just going to go ahead and snip that. Just like that. Now I'm just going to go and I'm going to iron this whole length of my strip. And then I'm just going to do the process 3 more times. So I'm going to take my end piece, I'm going to fold it over here, matching my right sides together. And with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, backstitching at the beginning and the end, I'm going to sew all the way down this strip. So I'll bring you back when we're ready to put the sashing on. Alright, so here is our quilt top. And I did say that we're going to do that 3 more times. I actually did it 4 more times. So this measures about 56 inches this way and 62 inches this way roughly. It just depends on your seam allowance and all that. Now you could just keep it like this and skip the sashing and the border and then just add the backing, batting, and tie it together. This will be a perfect lap size quilt or a quilt for a kid, but I'm a beefy boy, so I need some more inches. So I took 2 of my sashing strips. I laid them with the right sides together and sewed them together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then I went ahead and I pressed my seams open. Now I like to do the sides first and then top and bottom. So now I'm just going to sew on my sashing strips. So my quilt is right side facing up. I'm going to put my sashing strip facing down. And with that same 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and the end and sew all the way down. Now as far as the seam on your sashing, you could put it in the middle on both sides if you want, but I kind of like to spread it out a bit. So on this strip, my seam is right here. And on this side, I put it down here. So now I'm just going to sew on my sashing strips on the side and then do the same thing to the top and the bottom. Alright guys, so now that I have my sashing on, I went ahead and I just pressed it open. And now it's time for the border. Now this is the time where you can add length or width to your quilt depending on how big you want it. Today I'm going to do a 6-inch border. So I went ahead and cut my strips into 6 inches. Now like I said, this was 108 inches wide. It's actually backing fabric. So I only used 4 strips. But if you're going to use regular cotton, the 40 to 42 inch width, you're going to need 2 strips per side. So you're going to want to get about 1.5 yards for the border. So I'm just going to do the exact same thing as the sashing. I'm going to sew on the sides with my 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now it's just going to be the same process like the sashing. I'm going to sew on the sides first and then the top, and then I'm just going to trim it flush. Alright guys, so unfortunately my camera was off when I filmed this last part. However, it was very simple and very easy. So all I did was take 5 yards of flannel, I fold it in half, and then I sewed down one of the long edges. After that, I went ahead and I cut the crease, and I pressed it flat. And that's what we have right here. Now the reason why it's two different colors is because it's two different brands. The next thing I did was I laid my flannel down with the seam face down, and I smoothed it all flat. After that, I put my quilt top on top, smoothed that flat, and then I went ahead and I pinned around the edges and a few pins on the center. And here is one of the pins, and as you can see, I stayed about a hand width away from the edges all the way around the quilt. Next, with my fabric scissors, I went ahead and I trimmed all the way around the flannel to the same size as my quilt top. Next, I went ahead and I laid my backing piece, which is my sheet, down. I have it facing up. And then I went ahead and I smoothed it nice and flat, or as flat as I could get it on the carpet. So next, I'm going to put my quilt top facing down, and I'm going to smooth that nice and flat also. When that's as smooth as you can get it, now we need to pin around the edges, and I'll be using these bent safety pins. You could just use regular safety pins if you want, or just regular pins if that's all you have, but I find that these bent ones really help, especially when I'm pinning this together on the carpet. So I'm going to pin pretty heavily around the edges. I'm going to leave an 8-inch opening somewhere along the side. It really doesn't matter. I usually tend to do it at the bottom though. And then I'm just going to throw a few pins in the center. So we'll say that this is my bottom. So I'm going to pin through all 3 layers. And then I'm going to leave an 8 to 10 inch gap. And I'm just going to eyeball it. And then just continue pinning all the way around, and then throw a few in the center. Alright guys, so I did go ahead and I trimmed my sheet to match the edge of my quilt top and the batting. Do a little better job than I did here. And now I'm going to use a fat 1/2 inch, even a 3/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to sew all the way around. Of course, you're going to want to leave your little opening. So I'm going to backstitch here in the beginning about 3 or 4 times. This is a lot of fabric that we're going to pull through this opening, so you really don't want any of your stitches to pop. And then just keep sewing. And if any of your pins get in the way, go ahead and just remove them. Alright, so I'm coming up to my corner. You just want to stop about a 1/2 inch away. I'm just going to eyeball it. You want to stop with your needle down, raise your presser foot, and spin. And sew. Alright guys, so I'm coming up to my last pin, so don't forget to backstitch. Alright guys, so now that I sewed all the way around, I'm going to take my pinking shears and I'm going to pink the edges. Now that I have it all sewed around, leaving my opening open, I'm going to take my pinking shears and I'm going to pink with about a fat 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around, except where my opening is. I like to leave all the fabric there. That way I know I catch that when we go to close that opening. And for the corners, I'm going to go ahead and clip them just like that, making sure that you don't go through your seam allowance. Now before you do any pinking, it's a great idea to make sure that you sew through all 3 layers. Especially make sure that you got your quilt top in the center. I think this is good, so I'm going to start pinking. So here is my opening. I'm going to keep all that fabric there. And then I did about that wide of a seam allowance. After I have that all finished, we're going to turn this right side out. So I have this all flipped out. With my bone folder, I'm going to go over to the corners and make sure that they're poked out and as sharp as you can get them. You could also use your scissors if you're very careful. Then I'm just going to come over to my opening and I'm going to give it a little tug. Just like that, to make sure that my raw edges tuck on the inside. Now you could go ahead and give this a press, and then I'm just going to stick a few pins to close that opening. Now this next part is kind of tedious and boring, but I'm going to go around the whole edge and I'm going to roll my seam. I just kind of lick my fingers a little bit. I'm going to roll my seam. Make sure that everything is nice and flat. And then I like to go ahead and just throw some pins. You don't have to do this part, but it does make it the top stitching a lot easier. I'll be using an 1/8 inch seam allowance, so I'm just going to line up the edge of my quilt with my presser foot, and I'm going to move my needle over to the right. If you don't have that function on your sewing machine, you just want to measure about an 1/8 inch away from your needle, and for my machine it's somewhere right around in here. So I'm going to backstitch in the beginning and the end. And make sure you remove your pins as you go. Alright guys, so I'm coming up to my corner, and just like before, I'm going to stop, this time an 1/8 of an inch away. And just kind of eyeball it. I'm going to stop with my needle down, raise my presser foot, and spin. And keep on sewing on. So finally, we just need to finish this off by tying this together. So I'm going to use some red crochet thread, and I'm actually going to put a tie in every single one of my accent squares. So I'm just going to get a length of my crochet thread. I'm going to thread it onto my needle. Now this needle is way too big. Usually I use a ribbon needle. It has a larger eye and not such a sharp point, but I can't find them. So now I'm just going to go down through my square in the middle. I'm going to go through all 3 layers, and then I'm going to come up about a 1/4 inch away. Just like that. So I'm going to take my thread end, I'm going to wrap it through 2 times. And then pull it. Now you don't want to pull it really tight at this point because it will get a pucker. So now I'm going to take my thread tails again, and I'm going to go through my loop 2 more times. And this time you could pull it really tight. And then I'm just going to clip it, leaving a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch thread tail. Now if you don't want to see your little knots or your threads, you could do this from the back. So I'll show you one more time. So I'm going to go through all 3 layers, come up about a 1/4 inch away. If you want, you could go underneath just to make sure that you went all the way through. I'm going to wrap it 2 times. And then 2 more times. And pull it snug. And then just clip the threads. And I'm going to continue to do that until I have all my squares knotted. And just like that, your first quilt is done. Now I still have to go through and trim any of these little extra threads sticking out. If you're going to give this as a gift, I always tell people don't pull the threads, just clip them. I really love how this quilt turned out. Now blue is my favorite color, so I always like the blues and the greens. And I just love how that red pops. Now here's the first one that I did. I did that blue and yellow jelly roll with black accents and then the blue border. Now this one is just a little bit smaller than the one we just made, only because the strips weren't as long. Like I said, normally they're 40 to 42 inches, so that's why it's just a little bit smaller. After sewing all these strips together, I guarantee you'll have a pretty good concept of what a 1/4 inch seam allowance is, and the way your fabric's going to move with your sewing machine. Like I said, this is a perfect beginner's quilt. If you like this video and want to see more of my videos, go down below and hit that big red subscribe button, and give this video a big thumbs up. If you have a question about this video or any of my other videos, or just like to leave a suggestion for a future upcoming video, leave me a comment. If you'd like to support this channel, head on over to my Etsy store. I'll link it down below, and you can see what I'm making over there. I have some one-of-a-kind Scrappy Patch tumblers, as well as some Scrappy Patch koozies. I also have my social media links down below if you'd like to follow me over there. And as always, thanks for watching. Good luck on your first quilt, and I'll see you next time.